Boa tarde e bem-vindos a todos. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Norman Nadorff, and I'm a director of the Brazil-Texas Chamber of Commerce, BRATEC, and counsel to the Mayer Brown law firm. On behalf of the organizer, BRATEC, sorry for that. Let me start again. Boa tarde e bem-vindo a todos. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Norman Nadorff, and I'm a director of the Brazil-Texas Chamber of Commerce, BRATEC, and counsel to the Mayer Brown law firm. On behalf of the organizer, BRATEC, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Brazil's Anti-Corruption Law, What Preceded Operation Car Wash and What Lies Ahead. I would like to thank Mayer Brown, the financial and technical sponsor of the event. BRATEC is devoted to fostering business and friendship among American and Brazilian companies in a variety of ways, including networking opportunities and webinars like this. We are proudly in our 20th year of existence, a milestone we plan to celebrate in August. As the first order of business, I would like to introduce to you our distinguished panel. Let me start with Eduardo Hage. Since 2008, Eduardo has been a federal prosecutor for the Brazilian Federal Prosecution Service, where he specializes in anti-corruption investigations. In that capacity, he has been heavily involved in various aspects of Operation Car Wash and other investigations. He is also a former evaluator of GAFILAT, Financial Action Task Force for Latin America, where he was part of a team that evaluated Uruguay's anti-corruption regime in 2019. Eduardo holds a law degree from Pontificia Universidade Católica do Rio de Janeiro and a master's degree in international human rights law. Christopher DeSá is a managing director at FTI Consulting and focuses on risks and investigations in Latin America. Chris is fluent in Portuguese and has lived, studied, and worked in Brazil for 20 years. He has worked on dozens of corruption and fraud investigations involving Brazilian companies, many of which relate to the Lava Jato scandal. More recently, he has also worked on numerous high-profile disputes and arbitrations associated with Lava Jato, including securities class action against Petrobras in the US, as well as several related international arbitration disputes. Chris holds a BA from UCLA, a JD from University of Texas, and a master's degree in Latin American politics and economics from the University of Oxford, UK. Michel Sancovski is a partner at Tauil Chequer, Advogados, in association with Mayer Brown in the Sao Paulo office. He holds an LLM from the UC Berkeley School of Law, a postgraduate law specialization diploma from the Fundação Getúlio Vargas, and a law degree from the Universidade Presbiteriana Mackenzie Law School in Sao Paulo. Michel focuses on corporate compliance and anti-corruption matters, and his experience includes advising in anti-corruption compliance cases, taking into account local and foreign laws, coordinating highly complex major investigations, developing, reviewing, and implementing compliance programs, and assisting with anti-corruption due diligences in third parties and M&A transactions. As guest professor at renowned institutions, he often lectures in compliance courses and has significant experience in providing in-house training to top executives. And finally, I'd like to introduce to you our Q&A coordinator for today, which is Liliana M. Coutinho. She's an associate in the Anti-Corruption and Compliance Group of Mayer Brown's Sao Paulo office. She is a dual qualified attorney, both Brazil and New York, and holds an LLM from the Columbia Law School and a degree from the Universidade de Brasília Law School. Liliana has experience in conducting internal investigations in Brazil, in the United States, and in the interaction and cooperation with local international businesses. So I think we can all agree this is a great panel to have this discussion today. very, very high qualified, and I'm looking forward to myself. But before we get started with the panel, I'd like to briefly introduce our topic. Now, prior to 1977, the year I started law school, by the way, there were no specific laws with international application regarding the bribery of government officials. All there were some local laws in each country, and their enforcement was pretty light and rather sporadic. Then in 1977, everything changed. In the wake of the Watergate scandal, the US Congress passed what is called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Most people refer to it as the FCPA, and you'll be hearing that term a lot today. And it does a couple of things. It prohibits covered parties, and these can include non-US companies and persons under certain circumstances. Very important to remember that this US legislation, the FCPA, has what's called long-arm jurisdiction, extraterritorial effect, we also say. And basically, it does two things. It prohibits these US companies and persons from paying bribes to foreign government officials. And that's very widely defined to include actually the employees of government-held or government-owned companies, such as, say, Petrobras in the case of Brazil, or Sonangol in the case of Angola. And number two, which most people often forget, it has a second element which requires these companies to maintain adequate books and records. Now, at the time this law was passed in 1977, with regard to that second record-keeping, book and record-keeping requirement, a lot of people said, well, the FCPA should actually stand for full employment for CPAs. And indeed, it has created a lot of employment for CPAs and lawyers, to be sure. Now, at first, enforcement of this law was quite light, and very few violators went to jail. What typically happened instead is that the companies that were found to have violated the FCPA did these kind of settlements in which they did not have to even admit any wrongdoing. But that changed a lot about two decades later, when enforcement significantly increased with the imposition of massive fines, and even more importantly, prison sentences, lengthy prison sentences, even of a US congressman, for instance, in several landmark cases. And then about 2 decades ago, other countries, with pressure actually from the United States, started passing their own similar legislation that largely mimicked the FCPA. So for decades, it was just the United States going around the world trying to fight against the bribery of foreign government officials. But then eventually, as I say, these other countries started to apply their own laws, and more importantly, began cooperating with anti-corruption officials in other countries. So when we talk about enforcement, it's no longer just the United States or just France or just Germany doing their own thing, but rather there's a lot of cooperation, and I'm sure that our panel will get to that today. Now, as far as Brazil is concerned, it joined the bandwagon as well in 2013 when the Brazilian Congress enacted what's called the Anti-Bribery law, and it kind of stayed unnoticed until news of the earth-shattering Operation Car Wash emerged. Well, the rest is history, and we're going to be discussing that history. And you, the audience, will also be participating in the form of questions later on. Now, before I turn this over to the panel and start asking a few questions, I want to tell the audience that there is a Q&A function in Zoom, which many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. I see one person's already asked a question, which is great. Anyway, so Q&A, and we have Liliana here to help us guide us through that process when we finish the discussion. So basically, please send your questions, send them with your name if you'd like to be acknowledged, or go ahead and just send them anonymously if you're more comfortable with that. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into our discussion. And Eduardo, I think I'll start with you, because of all the panelists, you're really the one with the most hands-on experience with Operation Car Wash. So to start this conversation, could you please briefly describe Operation Car Wash? Could you tell us about your role in it, and then how it changed anti-corruption law enforcement for good in Brazil? Eduardo.
Okay, thanks, Norman. First of all, thanks, Britac, for the invitation. Thanks for being with you guys today. For me, it's such an honor to discuss all these issues with such a qualified audience. So the car wash operation started in 2014 in Curitiba. And essentially, it started from a very small money laundering investigation, which suddenly became, I think, the the biggest corruption scandal in Brazil in its entire history. So some factors contributed a lot for this fact. In my point of view, I think the collaboration agreements, the law that was enacted in Brazil in 2013 against criminal organizations was the key factor for this change. Before 2013 and before all the protests here in Brazil, our system was heavily corrupt. Still it is heavily corrupt, but we did not have a framework that could deter or could provide the investigators and prosecutors with powerful tools. Nowadays, currently, we have collaboration agreements that can erupt criminal organizations and then bring a lot of distrust among the members of those criminal organizations. So if you have a criminal organization with 20, 30 people, if one of them make an agreement, all the scheme could vanish. So in my opinion, this was the key factor for the change that started to come in 2014 in Curitiba. And so suddenly the investigation passed from a money laundering scheme to the Petrobras scandal, and then evolved to reach the federal government. In 2016, the former President Dilma was impeached, and it brought a serious change here in Brazil. My role in this operation, I am the head of the task force in Rio, which is a branch of the car wash operation in Brazil. And my role here is to investigate the former governor of Rio, Sérgio Cabral, and also the crimes committed involving the nuclear power plant Angra, which is owned by Eletrobras, which is a state-owned company. Those of you who are familiar with Brazil know those cases from the TV and from the news. Sérgio Cabral is a very famous politician here in Rio, and he was infamous, known because he diverted more than $100 million and sent it to offshore accounts overseas in a number of tax havens. So the operation here in Rio has 5 years now. The task force has just finished it. We finished in 31 of March. So we are now in a new model named GAECO, but the fight against corruption here still evolves, and we all the know-how that we have developed throughout those 5 years, we are now applying, and now we are much more capable of investigating those sophisticated crimes nowadays than we were back in 2016. We had a number of setbacks recently, essentially because of some hacked messages, and which come with a very strong political backlash. So the operation is still trying to survive in certain aspects. But I think that the environment where the companies and the citizens now live is an environment which is much more healthier than it was in 2010, 2011, where the corruption was spread all over the country. So you couldn't win a bid without paying bribes, without paying 5% with a contract, with money in cash. Whereas nowadays, those schemes and those scandals still occur, but nowadays we have enforcement, we have prosecutors, we have people going to jail. Whereas in my generation, I am 40 years old, and I grew up just watching the TV, people stealing, and it was kind of folkloric here in Brazil. We have some very famous political figures that passed their entire lives without suffering any enforcement. So those were my first words. I am happy to be here and happy to answer the questions that the audience may have.
Yeah. Well, before I go on to one of the other panelists, would either Christopher or Michel like to just ask anything to Eduardo about what he's just said, or about his experience, or anything like that? Would you like to jump in there with a kind of question on that? Actually, I do have a question. Just give me a magnitude, for instance, of how many prosecutors at the peak time of Operation Car Wash would have been involved in this. I know it's probably a hard number to really give.
Yes, throughout the operation, we had a branch in Curitiba where the peak number was, I guess, 14.
Okay.
In Rio, the peak number was 13.
Okay.
It may seem a very small number, but our model in the Federal Prosecution Service, our traditional model was one prosecutor taking care and investigating 100 cases, and literally 100 cases. So we came from a model where one prosecutor was investigating 100 cases, and currently we have 12 prosecutors investigating only one case. So it made all the difference where you can put 10 heads, 11 heads in order to investigate those complex criminal organizations.
Well, just a quick comment, Norm. No, because I think in terms of context here, for those of us who've lived and followed Brazil for many years, first off, it's really a pleasure to be here with everyone. Certainly with Eduardo and the great work that the Ministério Público has done, it's a great honor. And maybe from the outside, just a comment for the viewers of how important the job that Eduardo and the Ministério Público and the team, how big this is, because I just want the viewer to understand, to Eduardo's point about the extent of corruption in Brazil, right? Many people are saying this is probably the largest corruption scandal in the history of democratic countries. So obviously there are other places with widespread corruption. We've had large corruption scandals, but it's hard. I certainly don't know of another case bigger than this. And so the context of Lava Jato, and the work that the Ministério Público has done, that the Polícia Federal has done in Brazil, and frankly, maybe one of the largest transformations in Latin America that occurred within Lava Jato. So just a comment and frankly, a note about the amazing work that the Ministério Público has done.
Yeah, well, I just want to compliment also, I'm really amazed that there are only that many prosecutors involved, because I've seen O Mecanismo, the mechanism, this Netflix mini-series about that. And if that's any indication of what was going on in terms of the work and the detailed work you had to do, it's just, it's spectacular to know that you're working with that small of a group. So parabéns, my compliments. So let's then move on, but let's kind of stay in the same framework a little bit. And Chris, I'd like to ask you something, because in my introductory remarks, I talked about how one thing that really changed in anti-corruption enforcement in the last 20 years is the cooperation that you now have between, or among, shall I say, various countries' anti-corruption. So, I mean, you, at any given time, there are, as I understand it, Department of Justice, for instance, FBI agents actually on the ground sometimes in foreign countries, helping those foreign countries, first of all, learn how to do these investigations better, sharing information and everything. So why don't you just tell me a little bit about how large of a role that the cooperation between U.S. and Brazilian anti-corruption authorities played in the success of Operation Car Wash, and more or less what was the nature of that cooperation?
Yeah, sure. And I'll be very interested to hear Eduardo's perspective from an internal perspective of what was going on. But I will say what is, you know, from my perspective, you don't have Lava Jato without the involvement of the DOJ and the SCC and the FBI. So one of those countries where the FBI has an agent station happens to be Brazil. The DOJ was making regular trips down to Brazil, and the amount of information sharing, evidence sharing, and cooperation on leniency agreements, on sanctions and damages. I'm sure Eduardo could tell us a lot about how that cooperation was occurring. But maybe one of the things I wanted to do is maybe step back and say, why was that? Why is it that in this particular case there was so much cooperation? And by the way, the extent of that cooperation, I think is best. I was just looking through some of my notes, and in 2017, Acting Assistant Attorney General Kenneth Blanco with the DOJ said, quote, "It is hard to imagine a better cooperative relationship in recent history than that of the United States Department of Justice and the Brazilian prosecutors." And if you want the best example of why there was so much cooperation and the extent of the cooperation, is just look at the largest monetary sanction that the DOJ has levied against any company. And at the top of that list is Odebrecht. And the next is, you know, Goldman Sachs, and then Airbus, and then the fourth down is Petrobras. So these are, as it turns out, the largest enforcement actions on the US side. And so the extent of the cooperation was particularly, you know, some of it was particular to the fact that Petrobras was listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Petrobras, as all of us know, is one of the largest oil and gas companies in the world. It's also a company that happens to have numerous US suppliers associated with it. Odebrecht, you know, just the story of Odebrecht and Petrobras in and of itself, as you know, Norm, even from the work in Angola, the size of Odebrecht globally and its connections with the United States itself meant that if you have a scandal where Odebrecht is at the heart of that scandal, you know, with Petrobras and government officials in Brazil, by the nature of the scale of that, you know, the parties involved, you necessarily have the leading financial institutions, the leading banks in the world are going to be involved. The scale of what we're talking about here too is in the billions. We're not in the millions. We're in the scale of just massive amounts of corruption in cases that are taking down two presidents effectively, with Dilma and indirectly impacting Temer. And so the combination of all those things meant that the U.S., and not only the U.S., you know, I heard Delton Dallagnol, who was one of the lead prosecutors, once say that there were 43 different countries, 43 countries involved in Lava Jato and the various angles and pieces. He says, you know, it's 1/5 of the world's, you know, countries have been involved some degree or other in Lava Jato. So the extent of cooperation, I think, is truly unprecedented.
Well, since you brought up Odebrecht, I had to tell a little story that I wasn't planning to bring up, but I have the dubious distinction that when I was with BP in Angola for 9 years, we did a major project among several oil companies with Odebrecht. And I was actually asked to go to Odebrecht's office and to give a lecture on anti-corruption law and anti-bribery to Odebrecht itself and all of its contractors. So obviously, I must not have had much of an effect there, but anyway, so anyway, so that's it's really interesting to hear about how, I like what you said about how it may not have even happened had it not been for that cooperation you're talking about. I didn't recognize that. So Michel, I'd like to hear from you now is basically, what aspects are there about the Brazilian legal system that made Operation Car Wash possible from an enforcement standpoint that might not be present in the legal systems of comparable jurisdictions? And I guess, let's say, Argentina or Colombia or, wherever.
Thanks, Norman, and good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thanks, Bratek, for the kind invite. It's a great pleasure speaking alongside with this distinguished co-panelist. So I think that's a very important question, an interesting one. And I would like to answer that, Norman. I would like to comment on a few key aspects. I think
okay.
The first one somehow echoes what Eduardo said, that, when we are back in 2013, before car wash, we had two main laws in Brazil that were enacted almost in the same day. The first one is the Brazilian anti-corruption law, and the second one is the law to combat criminal organization. And because of those two laws, one of them brought the possibility, as Eduardo said, like for the collaboration agreements to be signed by individuals. And the second one brought the possibility of leniency agreements by legal entities. And I think those two instruments, those two tools, they were fundamental to feed, information and disclose information to the prosecutors so that they would have, the ability to investigate and get to know facts that probably they wouldn't be without those two tools.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
I think it's important to mention also that happened right before Operation Car Wash. So as Eduardo said, Car Wash was launched in March 2014. And not only those two instruments were fundamental to the success of Car Wash, I think also I would list the behavior of Brazilian authorities with respect not only to enforcement in Brazil, but also to cooperation with foreign authorities. Now, we were used to, see cooperation among authorities, by sending formal letters that would take, weeks to come from one country to the other, and then weeks to get the answer. Now they speak like in real life. Eduardo can, tell us about that, like with WhatsApp, conference calls. And I think the common efforts from, the courts, because we know that a lawsuit, to have like a good result, whichever it is, even to convict or to acquit someone, it should have like be like in a timely fashion, I think. Otherwise, like the statute of limitation can have like a huge impact, particularly in Brazil. So the efforts from, the many stakeholders to move the ball rolling is another important aspect. And I think I see like as a final one, the support from the society as a whole, I think was fundamental also to support that work to combat corruption. I would, bring those aspects that probably is responsible for the success of Lava Jato.
Eduardo, could you give us a little taste of that, how that cooperation was between Brazil and US along the lines of what Michel was saying?
Sure. So to fight transnational crimes, it's essential to have transnational cooperation. And with financial crimes, this essentiality is even higher. So you cannot fight those kind of crimes if you don't cooperate with other agencies, if you don't receive bank records from Switzerland, from Liechtenstein, from the US. So it's impossible. And this was the situation in Brazil, I guess, 15, 10 years, 20 years ago. So we didn't have access to those bank records in a timely way.
Mhm.
So the hurdle was very big for us. So if you join and combine collaboration agreements, international cooperation, doing in an effective way, and all the environment and all the society asking for change, you have a real environment and a real country who is able to make a step further. So with the French authorities, I remember that we have launched an operation here in Rio, where French prosecutors were involved. They made the search and seizures with us. We receive nowadays documents and bank records from countries in the Caribbean, where some time ago we couldn't imagine to receive bank records from the Bahamas, from Antigua and Barbuda, and nowadays those countries they not only they respond to us, but they responded in a very swiftly way. So this made completely the difference. Also, the technology has helped us a lot. We do have some WhatsApp groups with Uruguayan prosecutors. With depends on the country. The Americans are more formal. French prosecutors are more informal. They sometimes we have groups in WhatsApp in order to talk and to combine the travels and stuff like this. So it depends on the country, but the change is very significant.
Okay. It's very interesting. So, let me stick with you for just a minute more, Eduardo. So, do you believe that would-be bribers, people who might think about bribing in Brazil, will be significantly deterred from violating anti-corruption laws, or will they just become more careful and cunning so as to prevent detection and prosecution? Do you get a feel there's been a real change in people's mindsets that the would-be bribers or government officials think, I might get caught?
Well, I don't think that the fight against corruption will happen in a very fast way. So this change will take some decades. The whole spirit of the society and the mindset of those powerful people here in Brazil, they are still entrenched with this bribery act, and so it's very hard to change this mentality. So it will not happen from day to night. It will take some time. And in Rio, we have a very interesting example. We have arrested the former governor, Sérgio Cabral, who has stolen $100 million. Then a second governor took place. It was his vice governor. We also arrested him. We also put him in jail. Then we had new elections, and the person who was a federal judge who said, "Look, I am the new politics. I don't belong to those people. I am a fresh one. I will change everything." And we also uncover a huge corruption scheme that he was involved in, and we did not arrest him, but we arrested the whole criminal organization. So it is very sad and frustrating by one hand, because we see that those things still happen. But on the other hand, nowadays the enforcement is happening, and we are working, and things are being done. So the mentality is still the same, but nowadays the enforcement agencies are capable of doing something.
There's an old country and western song called "Old Habits Are Hard to Break." So I guess that's probably the case with bribery. It's just too much of a temptation, because one would think with everything that you saw happening that there would be some hesitation. But I suspect you're probably right, Eduardo. It's going to be a long road.
I was going to say, it's also a bit of a challenge that the very subjects of the investigation and the bribery are themselves the legislators that pass the laws and/or
Right.
are in the judiciary that are going to do things to make sure that that doesn't happen. So it's a challenging task. To say the least.
I do have hope that things will change, and I truly have hope that things will change. But we cannot be naive that putting some people in jail, the country will become a new one from next day. We cannot be that naive. This is a very long process. We have to understand it. Otherwise, we will be frustrated in the first setback that we'll have. So it's a long run process. We cannot be so anxious about it.
Yeah, Christopher, what you said reminds me of a Spanish expression I've never heard said in Portuguese, but quien inventó la ley, inventó la trampa también. So it's like,
exactly.
Truque también.
Yes,
So,
exactly.
Anyway, but so let's move on. Someone mentioned this recent Brazilian Supreme Court decision or series of decisions, whatever. So Michel, could you walk us through that, what that decision was, and just talking about what kind of impact that decision or those decisions will have on the enforcement of Brazil's anti-corruption laws?
Sure, Norman. And speaking, when we talk about the future in Brazil, it came to my mind a say from a Brazilian economist, which was like a former minister, that said, even in Brazil, even the past is uncertain. So I'm trying to do my best here, like to predict what will be the impact. Or at least it should be the impact, right? But, on that specific decision, I think that I would like to comment in two ways at that question. The first one is specific. So the recent STF decision refers to a criminal case involving an individual, which is the former President Lula. And that on that case, the discussion was whether or not former Judge Moro convicted former President Lula with a bias and not being impartial, So, and I think on that decision, the big discussion here was whether or not, and I think that somehow is related to the messages that were leaked that Eduardo just mentioned, that suggests, I don't know, I'm not commenting on that, like even the source of those messages, if those messages were truth or not, it's hard to say, but the decision is that that according to the Supreme Court, Judge Moro was convicted Lula with a bias, and for that reason, his conviction was null, and then the procedure should start all over again since the beginning in a different court, which is in the Brazilian, the federal district. So basically, that the decision, and I think the impact of that decision, I think, on specific, I think probably this is something that prosecutors I know and judges, they are very concerned and they take a very serious in terms of care, because in Brazil, there's like a lot of appeals and, details that, a procedure, if it does not strictly follow that procedure, the procedure or the conviction could be null and void. So I think one of the lessons here, based on that, is that probably, I know this is something that prosecutors, they already pay a lot of attention, but probably for the future, they will be even more concerned to see, if a specific measure during the procedure could be questioned or challenged in the future that could impact the potential conviction here.
Right.
So, and I think whenever it relates to politicians, as we just said, I think that's an extra care that we should have, not only because they are politicians, but as Christopher said, perhaps, like the minister of the Supreme Court that will judge that was the one who was appointed by the politician that is being convicted or being like the target of that procedure. So this is something that we should, I don't know, Chris.
Just one comment on that. This particular politician may be quite impactful in the future, and his party, PT, and their role. And I think it's important. I can maybe point this out as from an outsider's perspective, and having been involved in many of these investigations. That very party And certainly during the time of Lula, both in Mensalão originally, the initial panel, and in Car Wash, throughout, was intimately involved in the schemes. And so one thing I want to point out is the STF is not saying that there was no fraud and bribery and corruption, all that. Rather, what they're saying is procedurally, there were problems. We'll have to remand it back to another court. What will happen? Yeah. But people should still know. No one is saying that these guys didn't structure one of the biggest corruption schemes in the history of Brazil, and maybe the history of the planet.
Yeah, be that as it may, though, when people see people walking from after a conviction ahead of time, regardless of what the technical reason was, that gives people the impression that maybe things are getting more lax, unfortunately. But so, Chris, I'd like to move on to you once again. And we talked a bit about how communications improved as a result of or during Operation Car Wash. But just in terms of like how you do your job, how would you say that Lava Jato, changed things in terms of conducting investigations and what you do, from day to day in your job, new techniques maybe that came about?
Yeah, I appreciate the question, because I'll start it off with an anecdote, which is I was operating in Brazil in 2010, 2011, working pre-Lava Jato, working in the compliance space, and my family's Brazilian and my wife's Brazilian, and I remember they used to say, "What do you do, by the way?" And I said, "I work in compliance." And I would get blank stares from people like, "What compliance? What is this thing?" And then Lava Jato hit. And next thing you know, Eduardo is a rock star in Brazil. The prosecutors are Delta Dallagnol all over the place interviewing. And next thing you know, everybody in my family is like, "Hey, compliance is amazing," it turned out. And so I say that anecdotally, but I mean that seriously. The sophistication. I mean, Michel's a testimony to this. Liliana is a testimony to, Eduardo certainly. The sophistication of the compliance industry, or what you might think of as the culture of integrity, is totally different. I mean, you can't, at all the companies involved, the 23 constructoras that were involved in all of them now have very sophisticated compliance departments. You can't do anything in Brazil now without the chief compliance officer actually having an important role. So despite the setbacks, I'm partially an optimist, right? Because Michel made a really good point about the civil society. And I don't think civil society is ready to give up on the fight against corruption, right? Corruption is just too important in Brazil. And so while there may be setbacks at the macro level and the federal level, I think the environment has totally changed. And maybe this is a shameless plug for the work that I do, but the other thing that's changed is the amount of information and intelligence in the market now, because of the thousands and thousands of delações premiadas, the pages and the information, which is all public, by the way. You can go look up the ones that have been homologado and see what the statements are. What that means is when we conduct investigations now, we often come across the same characters, Eduardo Cunha, Roberto Costa, there's a whole cast of characters. If you run into those people, right, they have a network of dozens of companies associated with them. So, and if you look at the number of people that have been implicated in Brazil, it's literally in the thousands. So it's actually pretty hard to conduct an investigation and weed through a lot of information implicating a lot of different people. The other thing I would say is, and maybe this is a shameless plug for Mayor Brown and Tauil Chequer, you absolutely need phenomenal external counsel in any case where you need to be conducting an investigation, especially now because of the number of agencies in Brazil that are hyper sophisticated. They're really good at what they do. In addition to the Ministério Público, you have Hage, you have TCU, you have the CGU, you have state officials, you have the number of agencies that are potentially implicated now and that are very sophisticated, means that you need sophisticated external counsel. But all of which I think is for the better.
Well, that shift is very true. I mean, my first year job out of law school was in a position that really was compliance, but no one knew to call it that. It wasn't a big group, a couple of people, at best. And even later on, I was kind of a part-time guru of FCPA law in a major oil company. I mean, we didn't have specialists or anything like that. So it's amazing how things have changed. We need to get to the Q&As, but before I do that, I want to ask each of you to tell me very briefly what you think is the biggest lesson that we learned or that you learned from Lava Jato. Eduardo, what lesson do you think that was learned?
Well, so many lessons were learned during those 5 years, so it's hard to point out one specific one. But I could say that the collaboration agreements introduction in the Brazilian system was a key factor for the change. Also, the joint team of investigators played a major role in our change in the Federal Prosecution's Office. And the third aspect that I would like to point out is the international cooperations field, which is fundamental for any financial investigation.
Michel, very quickly, please, because we go into the.
Sure. I will speak, about like the companies in the market. I think the best lesson is that I think companies now are aware the importance of having internal compliance programs, and I think Lava Jato brought a lot of attention to that area that in the past, I don't know how important that was inside of companies. I think particularly Brazilian
it wasn't. Yeah. Very good point. And finally, Christopher, before we get to the Q&As.
I would say fighting corruption is hard, and it's especially hard in Brazil. And I say that because there have been some setbacks recently that are disappointing, if I'm honest. But at the same time, I think if we look at Lava Jato in the context of just beginning the fight, right, then we'll see how much Lava Jato really has achieved in a massive amount. But there's still a lot that needs to be done.
Great.
And so the civil society component to it, I think the battle against corruption in Brazil has just begun.
Sure. Yeah, I'm sure we could spend hours talking about the lessons, but thanks to each of you for giving us your favorite lesson learned. So I'm going to take a break now, and I'm going to happily turn this over to Liliana Coutinho, because I knew that she'd do a better job of this than I would. So please, Liliana, o palco é teu.
Thank you, Norman. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Bratek. I'd like to say first that this discussion has been really interesting, and we have received some questions. So I'm going to select some of them for us to go through. I don't think we have time to go through everything. So the first one is about how the pandemic has affected anti-corruption enforcement in Brazil. Do you see any changes on how matters have been handled considering the COVID-19 pandemic?
Very interesting. Eduardo, maybe?
Yes. In a first moment, it really hit us very hard because I think that everyone was didn't know what to do, and it's hard to cope the work and the course here. So the first 1 or 2 months were really hard to try to start getting things done. But once we got in a pace, nowadays I think it's even better in some aspects because we don't have the commuting, and we can concentrate more in some specific investigations. Whereas when we were in the office, everybody was talking, and it's hard to sit and write. So last year, when the pandemic really started, we had, I think, 20 operations, which is a very significant number. So more than 1 operation per month. And those operations really take a lot of time and resources. So we could do our jobs despite of the pandemic.
Great. Anybody else want to comment about how?
I can comment, and I can comment, from from the perspective of companies conducting internal investigations, and I think Chris as well, because whenever you're conducting internal investigations, you have like to collect devices, collect computers, and of course that's a challenge. Doing interviews remotely without being able to see people and also cooperating. Whenever you have like a leniency agreement that you are discussing with the federal prosecutors, you have to move everything to virtual, and of course that somehow has an impact, right? And I think we managed well. I think we developed some tools to conduct interviews and also collect devices. For some cases we needed to go to the employee's place to collect the computer, because they wouldn't have any way to collect it differently. But this is something that we managed. So I think there was a huge impact on internal investigations, but I think practitioners, we were able to manage that. And I don't know, Chris, from you, I think on your end,
I 100% agree. Initially, in particular, we actually had physical meetings that got canceled. I was actually in an arbitration that was kind of tangentially related that got canceled. It was in Brazil. I had to come back, and so initially, I agree, Eduardo. Like everybody getting used to the new technology too. It's very hard to get conduct interviews. There's this physical dynamic that you have doing things remotely that kind of got messed up. But I do think over time we all kind of started learning by doing, and to the point where I feel like everyone, especially more recently, is kind of accustomed to doing investigations remotely. It's still difficult collecting data, doing data analytics, doing forensic review. It's still tough. Remotely. I will say one negative about all this is I don't get a chance to travel down to Brazil as much as I would have liked to. Now everything is remote, and so I feel like I don't have an excuse to go down as much.
Great. And another interesting question that I got here, and this is specifically to Eduardo actually, is what is the biggest challenge that they currently face in the prosecutor's office in relation to investigating, if it comes to resources or if the cooperation with international authorities? What has been the hardest part for the investigations?
I guess the resources, we still face a very lack of resources here. Last year, we were trying to use the money that was being paid in collaboration agreements to buy equipment, because the money laundering law enabled us to use it. But recently, Alexandre de Moraes, the Minister of the Supreme Court, just issued a decision saying that all this is illegal and we cannot use it. So we depend on the budget that the General Prosecutor's Office sent to us, and it's insufficient. So we don't have the appropriate software. Sometimes we have to buy our own computers. We don't have where to storage our data. So we are surviving, but not in the best shape. The resources are still very tiny, especially when we compare the enormous challenge that we are facing here in Brazil. So if we had more resources, we would be better.
Okay. Another question that we have here, and I think this would apply to all of you, is what do you believe are the main trends in anti-corruption enforcement for the next years in Brazil?
Trends, I can give like my opinion in one of the topics. During the pandemic, we see a lot of flexibilization in terms of public rules. For Eduardo just mentioned like the former governor of the state of Rio being involved on corruption scheme for respirators and being removed from his position. I think because of that flexibilization that was of course justified because the pandemic that the world was suffering. On the other hand, many corruption schemes may have can arise in the future, and then it can be discovered in the future. during that time. So I think one of the trends could be, investigation and perhaps new operations on that area, to supply of equipment, medical devices and equipment, because of particularly involving, like the state hospitals, the government. And I think this is natural because, we have a very strict rule to buy equipment, but during the pandemic that was somehow flexibilized.
I can just jump in from a private sector standpoint. And it makes me somewhat optimistic because I think while there may be some challenges which are expected at the federal and political levels, pushing back against corruption, at the private company level, it's going exactly the opposite direction. And I also mean from foreign investors. So one of the areas, ironically, that we're seeing a huge move is into, and I'm sure Michel, you guys are seeing this too, Norm, is around ESG issues. On the environment, social, and governance, on the S and the G, corruption fits under that. And so you have all of the major asset managers, BlackRock, State Street, Fidelity, all pushing for more accountability on social and governance issues, including around corruption. And so even if there's pushback by the STF and a lot of other things, the market is moving on. We saw that during the Trump administration here, right? Which was ironically, although he was pushing things back from an environmental standpoint, a lot of companies were actually going even further. So even if the government doesn't move, civil society and the private sector is going to keep on moving. And so that makes me optimistic.
Okay. Good.
Yes, I totally agree with Chris, because companies will not bet on the government and the judiciary to shield them from further actions. And all of the companies now just saw the huge impact in their images and in their assets that a police operation can cause. So no one is crazy to believe and to bet that in the future there will be no more police operations or enforcement. So I think that everyone now is taking measures, taking steps in order to avoid being targets in future operations. So no one will trust that the impunity will rule in Brazil.
So, and I think I agree, Eduardo. So in one hand, we've seen, as we mentioned, a turmoil on the Lava Jato. I think that somehow impacts, but I think Brazil achieved a stage in terms of combat corruption that even with those challenges that we discussed today, I think it's really hard to predict that we would move back to the position that we were, before Lava Jato. Of course, we always have challenges, I think, particularly in Brazil, but I think the move that we were able to have here, we will continue, right?
Great. Well, it looks like actually we're getting very close to the end of our hour, so I think we won't have any time for any more questions, but I'd really like to first thank Bratec for organizing this event. I'd like to thank Mayor Brown for its sponsorship. I'd like to thank all of you panelists and Liliana, especially for your participation. I learned a whole lot today. I'm sure that everybody learned a whole lot. And I think we could have gone on talking for a long, long time. And maybe we'll get to do that, the five of us someday when COVID's over and we're able to travel more. But anyway, I really thank you. And I want to thank the audience for both your participation and for your questions, which were very good. So please stay tuned for future Bratec and Mayor Brown events. And muito obrigado pela sua atenção. Thank you for your kind attention e até logo. Obrigado.
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 Thank you.
Thank you.
Obrigada, tchau.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.